Okay, welcome to Lecture 6. We're going to be covering Chapter 6 today. And you should have already read the chapter at this point. I mean, hopefully you read the chapters before you watch the lectures. That way the lectures make a little more sense. But you do the best you can, right? So we're going to start talking about specific moral theories, and Chapter 6 is the first moral theory that we've actually encountered. So up to this point, we've been talking about different moral principles, different ideas that are constitutive of moral theories. This is the first time we're actually going to put all these things together into actual moral theories that we can use to figure out what the right thing to do is, right? So what a moral theory is going to do is it's going to look at the set of things we take to be moral truths, right? These are just, I'm not saying these are the moral truths, just the things that we would just sort of intuitively think are the moral truths. And then it's going to try to give an explanation for why those are the intuitions we have about the things that are morally right or wrong. And so all moral theories are trying to explain what is it that makes something morally right or wrong. I mean, that's the central question that they're trying to answer. And so all of the views that we're going to be looking at from this point forward are all trying to answer that same question. What makes something right or what makes something wrong in a moral sense, right? And not surprisingly, there are a number of different ways to answer that question. And so we're going to see a bunch of them. We're going to start out with some of the more simple. I was going to say, well, there's simpler theories. I mean, theories can be, more complex. When we get to Kant, you're going to see how things can get really complex. But for now, we're going to start out with consequentialism, which is a range of views. So there's not just one consequentialist theory. There are a number of different consequentialist theories. We're just going to look at two of them. But all consequentialist theories are going to have, certain things in common. So I'll get to that in just a second. But I'm just giving the broad landscape for where we are right now. So we're going to start with some of the simpler theories, but the first couple of chapters that we're looking at, chapters 6, 7, and 8, are actually some of the more popular theories among ethicists. Excuse me. Welcome to me in the mornings. This is why I normally record my lecture videos in the evenings, because mornings are not my time. And also, I can't drink anything in the mornings. I mean, I guess I could, but I have a meeting with my advisor at 3, so that's not going to be conducive to having a really fruitful conversation. So I have tea and my bed face. Excellent. This is going to be a party. Woohoo! Okay, so the specific moral theory that we're going to talk about in this chapter is called act utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is, as I said, a consequentialist theory. Tilly, hush. My dog is bored because we don't go anywhere anymore, and so she's taken up barking as a hobby. So she hears the dogs in the neighborhood. She's like, oh my God, I can finally chat with somebody. Better get into it. That's great. Okay. So what is consequentialism? Well, we need to backtrack just a little bit and ask another question before we get to that one. And that other question is about what we typically assign the property of being morally right or morally wrong to actions. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to say what is it that makes an action, right? So we're going to look at action specifically. What is it that makes an action morally right or morally wrong? And there are a number of different ways you can answer that question. Of course, this is philosophy. So you have to look at how an action is brought about. Like, there are different parts of an action, right? Producing an action is a process. It's got inputs and it's got outputs, okay? So you have an input, right, to this process of performing an action, is going to be an intention, right? So you intend to do a particular thing. So I intend to pick up my coffee cup, right? So you can't act unless you first intend. Now, you can behave in certain ways, right? So perhaps I'm just a little bit jittery this morning and I'm just kind of, or, fidgety, right? If I'm fidgety, my fidgetiness is not an action. It's just a behavior. It's not something I'm intending to do. It's just something that I'm doing, right? It's sort of a mindless activity. An action, on the other hand, is a very particular kind of behavior. It's a behavior that's done with intention, okay? So you have to have an intention, and then you perform an action, and then that action has consequences, right? So we've got three different things that we can look at here. We can look at an intention. Of course, we're looking at the action, but we're looking at, it's not the action itself that's relevant. It's either the intention or the consequences. I hope that makes sense. It'll make more sense as we go along. For this theory, for the first three theories that we're going to look at, this framework works, right? Okay, so suppose that I end up killing a bunch of kittens. Is my action of killing kittens right or wrong morally? You need a little more information in order to answer that question, right? So, did I intend to kill them? Or was it an accident? So you might think that, well, look, even though I kill a bunch of kittens, if I kill them accidentally, then I haven't done anything morally wrong, right? Perhaps I intended to help them, right? So my intention wasn't to kill kittens. My intention was to help kittens, and then the consequence of my action turns out to be that they all die. It happens sometimes, right? So I didn't intend bad things. I intended very good things, right? So oftentimes when we call somebody out on bad behavior, the first thing they're going to say is, hey, look, I had good intention. People always want to be judged by their intentions and not the consequences of their actions. So it's interesting, like when we judge other people, we tend to judge other people based on the consequences of their actions. But when we're being judged, we're always like, hey, now I had a good intention. And you can't really have it. You can't have it both ways. It has to be one or the other. And we'll see why as we go along. So that's kind of a double standard, right? So if you want to be judged on what your intention was, not on the consequences of your action, then you're going to have to extend that same kind of grace to other people. But it's really difficult to know what another person's intention was. And so we tend to just rely on the consequences. But again, that's a moral double standard, because you're going to get a different result based on whether or not you think the intention is what makes an action morally right or wrong, or whether you think the consequences are what make an action morally right or wrong. So somebody who thinks that the intention is what matters, my intention to help the kittens was a good intention, so I have done nothing morally wrong. But for somebody who cares about the consequences, they're going to say it doesn't matter what your intention was. Your intention is irrelevant. You killed kittens. You are morally responsible for that action. You have done something morally wrong, right? Well, let's skip the moral responsibility part. Let's just say you've done something morally wrong, okay? Now, like I said, depending on where you put the emphasis when you're assessing the moral rightness or wrongness of an action, you might get a different result, right? So the same act, trying to save kittens or intending to save kittens, but accidentally killing them, that's one action, but you get two different results if you look at the intention versus if you look at the consequences. If you look at the intentions, you've done nothing morally wrong. If you look at the consequences, you may very well have done something morally wrong. So your theory, depending on where you put the emphasis, is going to give you different results. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at these theories and say, okay, which one do we think gives us the best result, right? And that's not easy, because sometimes theories give us a lot of results that we think are good, and a few, really weird things. But it's not enough to throw the theory out, even if you get these weird results. I mean, every theory is going to have a group of results that it seems to get that are right, and then a whole bunch of cases that just seem to be really off. You're not going to have a single moral theory that's going to give you all the right answers, unfortunately. Now, does that mean that there isn't a moral theory that can give us all the right answers? Not at all. It just means that we haven't come up with it yet, right? Or that we're just not really clear on what the moral truths are. Maybe one of these theories is accurate. We just don't know that it's throwing out the right result. And when we get more into consequentialism, you'll see why that might seem a little bit weird. All right, so I have here on the outline, I have deontological theories. We're going to get to deontology in chapter 8. Deontological theories are going to say that what makes an action morally right or wrong is the intention. Okay? If you had a good intention, that's all that matters. Consequentialists, of course, are going to say, no, the intention is irrelevant. The path to hell is paved with good intentions. What matters is the outcome. The outcome of that action is the only thing that matters. And you should be able to foresee that outcome. You should be able to rationally look at a situation and predict what the outcome is going to be. So if you fail to do that, you're responsible. Okay. We'll see how that can get a little bit complicated. All right. So the consequentialist theories are usually going to have like one foundational moral principle. And it's going to be something like this. So I have an example down here. So premise 1, I can spend my money on a vacation, or I can donate it to the LGBTQ plus youth center for homeless youth. Okay, that's my first premise. Premise 2, I ought to perform the action that produces the greatest net good for the greatest number of people. Okay, so that's a consequentialist moral principle. It's about maximizing benefit and minimizing harm. Well, it can just be about maximizing benefit. We'll get into how you can actually run the calculations. There are different ways you can do it. But you want to do the action that produces the most amount of good while producing the least amount of negative stuff, right? Bad, whatever you think bad consists in. Okay, so donating, so I ought to perform, again, premise 2, I ought to perform the action that produces the greatest net good for the greatest number of people, right? So it's not just the greatest good for myself. That's ethical egoism. It's not just the greatest good for my friends and family. It's the greatest good for all people, right? So when we get into discussing this a little bit further, you'll see how the scope, you have to sort of adjust the scope of the, when you're considering consequences, you have to consider everybody who's affected. So it's the greatest number for the greatest number of people. If I can perform an action that's only going to benefit my friends and family, or I can perform an action that's going to benefit a greater number of people, I'm morally obligated to perform that action. So this seems to have the result that we should choose the greater good over even friends and family if we can. It does have that implication, which some people find really odd. Okay, so what premise 3, donating my money to the LGBTQ plus youth center will produce the greatest net good for the greatest number of people. So I ought to donate my money to the youth center instead of using it to go on vacation. That's just a moral deliberative process, like the deliberative process that we talked about in chapter 4. So consequentialist theories are going to differ on how we ought to calculate the value of consequences and how we ought to define the value of consequences. Okay, so how do we do debits and credits with harms and benefits, like good and bad? You have to sort of balance it out and find out what action is going to be the best on balance, right? Is it just, part of the problem with making these kinds of calculations is you might not have a lot of information, right? So there's a fact about what's going to produce the greatest amount of good, but you might not have access to that information. So you might not be able to calculate the way you would need to calculate to do a perfectly moral action. So this is complicated. And what is good, right? So we're supposed to be producing the greatest amount of good, but what is that? Well, there are a lot of different views on what things are good. What is the foundational moral value? And we're going to talk about a really simple theory today that defines that in terms of one thing only: pleasure. Okay, so this gets us into utility and value and the work of John Stuart Mill. So utility is just a technical term. They use it a lot in economics. This is a traditional term in some of these traditional utilitarian theories. Nowadays, most people just talk about benefit or harm or good and bad. They don't really talk about utility. But since it's in the book, we'll discuss it. Utility is a measure of the degree to which a consequence promotes a foundational value. Okay, remember in chapter 1 we talked about foundational values. And disutility is just the opposite, right? I don't know why we need all this extra terminology. I really don't. I think it's excessive. But so utilitarianism is going to define utility in terms of pleasure. So the good, the foundational good that we aim to promote in a utilitarianism, utilitarian theory, is going to be pleasure. So we want to do the action that's going to produce the greatest net pleasure for the greatest number of people, something like that. That's one way to formulate a foundational principle for a utilitarian theory. Again, if an action has a high level of disutility, that means it produces a great deal of pain. Okay, so pleasure, pain. These are the only two foundational values, according to this group of theories, utilitarianism. Okay. So John Stuart Mill, he first proposed a consequentialist theory that we tend to think of as like, well, there are a couple people in that time frame who were writing, you know, in a similar vein, but Mill is the one that we tend to. Was Bentham? I'm trying to think if Bentham was before, concurrent with or after Mill. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There's another theorist, Jeremy Bentham. I want to say that Bentham and Mill were contemporaries, but maybe not. It's been a long time since I've taken a normative ethics class on detailed theories like that. Okay, anyway. Okay, so Mill defined utility in terms of happiness. But what's happiness? Obviously, it's something that I'm not experiencing today. Look at my face. Is this a happy face? What the fuck is happiness? So happiness can be really difficult to define. There are a number of different theorists who define happiness in a number of different ways. So for instance, Aristotle, who was an ancient Greek philosopher, who was not a utilitarian, he had a completely different moral theory, which we'll talk about later. But he defined happiness in terms of flourishing, right? So what makes a human being flourish? Well, so that's not really very consistent with our contemporary view of what happiness is, right? We tend to think of happiness as an emotion, right? Of this positive state of being. But that's actually just a very weird contemporary view. For most of history, happiness was more consistent with this sort of view that Aristotle promoted. Of course, Aristotle reigned supreme. His ideas pretty much reigned supreme throughout history into the Middle Ages, but until the Enlightenment. But it was typically thought of as something not like an emotional state, not a feeling. Right? So this emphasis, this focus that we have in contemporary society on the way that we feel, that's kind of foreign to ancient Greek philosophers. That's kind of foreign to any other time period except, you know, right now, right? So where did this emphasis on feelings come from? Well, Mill is the one who first decided, well, let's identify happiness with pleasure. And pleasure is actually, it's not really a feeling, it's an experience that has a certain sort of qualitative feel about it, right? So pleasure is actually an experience that we all have, and Mill was like, look, if we all have the ability to experience positive and negative states like pleasure and pain, maybe these are the kinds of things that are morally relevant, right? So we should do what we can to promote the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. We should not, do things that are going to promote a lot of pain. That seems pretty intuitive and straightforward. But once you start getting into looking at this a little bit more, you have to ask yourself, well, okay, but there are different kinds of pleasure. And there are different degrees of pleasure and qualities. Like different kinds of pleasure can have different feels and different qualities. So you can have a very intense but short lasting pleasure. You can have a very mild but long lasting pleasure. Which one weighs more in your calculations? Right? So if you're trying to calculate, what am I going to do? What's the morally correct action for me to do in a particular situation? I have to put weights on these different kinds of pleasure. Like, does a more intense but short-lived pleasure weigh more in my deliberations than the less intense but longer? How do you measure that stuff? And what is a unit of pleasure, right? We're pretending, one of the things we do with this kind of theory is we pretend that we can actually calculate units of pleasure and units of pain. But what is a unit of pleasure or a unit of pain? It's not like a dollar bill, right, that you can pass along. It's not like currency. It's not like anything else. You have to sort of somehow figure out a way to quantify. And what we do, we basically just pretend. We pretend that we can do this. Morality requires pretending. Isn't that fun? So here's a problem. Excuse me while I scratch my ear like an uncouth bitch. You guys have probably seen it all from me by now, so I don't honestly really even care. All right, so here's a problem. If all that matters is pleasure, and we're just supposed to maximize pleasure for the greatest number of people, well, what about the psychopath who likes to torture and dismember prostitutes? That gives them a great deal of pleasure. I mean, sexual sadists and psychopaths, I mean, there are sexual sadists out there who are not like serial killers, or they might have sociopathic tendencies. They might not. I don't know. But sexual sadism is a very real thing, where people, it's a terrible condition. I would expect that having the condition is awful, and being the victim of the condition is awful. It's just awful all around. But a sexual sadist is somebody who can't be sexually aroused unless they're inflicting pain, some terrible pain on others. So a lot of like these sexually motivated serial killers are all sexual sadists, right? Jeffrey Dahmer was a sexual sadist. Any of the major serial killers that you can probably think of were sexual sadists. And there are people who, like I said, did not become serial killers who are also sexual sadists, and a lot of them were just serial rapists or serial torturers. So these people get a great deal of pleasure out of doing what they do. And some of the stories that you hear, I mean, I listen to true crime podcasts, so I've heard so many stories. I don't know why I do this. It's kind of a dark interest, and a lot of women are very interested in true crime, and I think it's because we're worried about this shit happening to us. We think that if we listen to these stories, we can somehow get some tips on how to protect ourselves, which is ridiculous because the problem isn't women protecting themselves. The problem is men killing women, which is overwhelmingly the case when you listen to these podcasts. It's probably a good 80 to 90% of them are women being tortured and murdered by men. It's great. So that was sarcasm, by the way. In case anybody was wondering what sarcasm looks like, you just witnessed it. So what about these people? You have to think about these people in your moral calculations. If you're just going to go by the letter of the law, the principle says that you have a moral obligation to maximize the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Well, what if you're in a room with one normal person and 5 sexual sadists? Well, are you morally obligated to let them torture and rape this person? But that seems to be what the principle says. So, seems like there might be a problem here. There's got to be a way to fix this problem, because you can't have a moral theory that says, oh, look, you should sacrifice innocent people to sexual sadists. That's your moral obligation. That's the morally correct thing to do in a situation, is your moral obligation. So there's something kind of not right about this. And if anybody's going to try to make this sort of argument, they're probably not thinking about it clearly. So we have to, as simple as the theory looks on the surface, as you try to actually work out the kinks in it, like this kinky shit, sexual sadism, I want to back up here and say that there are some people who have sadist tendencies, but who manifest them in an appropriate way. So a lot of people who are in the BDSM community are in consensual, sadistic sort of relationships. That's consensual, okay? So that's a completely different story. If it's consensual, that's not the issue. That I don't have an issue with that. I know people who belong to BDSM communities, and they are fine individuals. I have actually some very good friends who are the kindest people I know who practice BDSM. Okay, fine. I don't have a problem with the consensual stuff. But I do have a problem with the non-consensual stuff. And some sexual sadists really, really need it to be non-consensual, and that's how they get their pleasure. So I have a problem with any moral theory that's going to tell me I ought to sacrifice myself to a group of sexual sadists in order to, increase happiness and pleasure in the world. I'm going to say, I don't think so. fuck your moral theory, right? So you have to kind of sit down and think about, okay, what kinds of pleasures matter? Do the pleasures of the psychopath, are those as important as the pleasures of the average person? Um, uh, Mel was like, well, there's a way to solve this problem. He's like, there's higher pleasures and then there's lower pleasures. The higher pleasures are the things that we would tend to think of as being noble pursuits, like intellectual pleasures, you know, the pleasure you get in intellectual pursuits, treating people well, being pro-social, being a healthy member of a thriving community, blah, 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 right? So now we're just going to put restrictions on the kind of pleasures that matter. We're going to call those higher pleasures, and then the rest of them are lower pleasures. And when we're doing our calculation, we're going to weigh the higher pleasures more heavily than we weigh the lower pleasures. Okay. All right. And Mill also thought that people would choose these higher pleasures over lower pleasures if given a chance. So the only reason that people settle for these lower pleasures is because they don't have the option of getting higher pleasure. I actually think that this is a very problematic view. The book talks a little bit about it, but I'm actually not going to get into detail about why I think this is a problematic view, because I would like you to do that. So if you look at the outline, the lecture outline, I have discussion question number 1. And it's just this: explain why this issue. It says why it builds emphasis on the superiority of higher pleasures over lower pleasures might be problematic as a feature of a moral view that is supposed to be impartial. Okay, so that's a discussion question for this week. This is one that you can do. There are 2 in the outline. You can choose either one, and I'll put instructions on I'll put up a discussion board and put instructions for you for the week. But I'm not going to answer that question. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about why might that not be the best solution? What's going on there? And I want you to come up with something a little bit more in depth than what they go through in the book. Okay, I want you to come up with your own idea. That there should be a lot of things that you can say about that. So think about it. All right. So act utilitarianism. We're going to talk about 2 different kinds of utilitarianism. One of them is act utilitarianism, which is what we're looking at now. And then there's rule utilitarianism. And the difference between them is that act utilitarianism is a moral theory about what to do in particular situations, like with respect to particular actions that you have to perform. Rule utilitarianism is about types of actions in, types of situations. Okay, so that's next week. So act utilitarianism, it's about specific situations, particular action in a particular situation, not a type of action, right? So when I say a type versus a particular action versus a type of action, I mean a type of action would be lying. That's a general thing that you can do in a number of different contexts. A particular action is lying to my neighbor about the PlayStation that I borrowed and broke. That's a particular action, okay? So that's a much more particular situation. And that's what act utilitarianism applies to. So according to act utilitarianism, the morally right act for any particular situation, right? So you've got a general rule to apply, but it applies to particular situations, not types of situations. The morally right act for a particular situation is the act that results in producing the greatest overall utility. All right. Now, what do we have to consider when we're looking at greatest overall utility? There are 4 things. I'm sorry, I know this lecture is really bad today, but it's the best I can do. So when we're talking about calculating our, trying to consider the consequences of a range of actions that we could perform in any given situation, we have to consider the scope of the consequences, right? So who's impacted? If you're going to lie, suppose that your partner says, hey, do you like this outfit that I have on? And you think the outfit looks like dog shit. You could lie just to avoid a fight or avoid hurting your partner's feelings. Or you could tell the truth. According to consequentialism, well, which one you should do is going to depend on the consequences And what's the scope of the consequences? Who's it going to affect if you lie? Well, directly, just you and your partner, but it doesn't seem like that lie would have negative consequences. It seems like it would have positive consequences, right? So it's going to have positive consequences in this situation. But what about consequences of consequences? So here's a scenario. Suppose that you say, "Oh, honey, that outfit makes you look fabulous," and your partner says, "Oh, great, I look fabulous," and then they go out and they go to some business function, and they have to stand up and they have to like give a presentation of some kind, and they look like absolute dog shit, and everybody is like, "Oh my God, do you see what she has on?" And it might end up being the case that in the long run, the lie harms her worse because she feels uncomfortable because she can tell that people are judging what she looks like. So that might be easy for you, but if you look at the consequences of the consequences, that might not be the best action because you might be putting your partner in a situation where she's going to suffer greater harm. Okay? So that's scope. Duration. What is the duration of these consequences, right? So how long will that effect last? Well, if you lie to your partner about the way they look, and then you go on your merry way and don't give another thought about it, but then she goes and she gets made fun of and made to feel very uncomfortable for choosing an outfit that is perhaps inappropriate or just extremely unflattering. Look, I'm not saying it's good that people make fun of people. And I'm not saying that we ought to dress to make sure nobody makes fun of us. I'm just using this as a scenario, okay? Suppose that this happens. Suppose that this person has no fashion sense whatsoever, and that they're going to be presenting and you just don't even, you don't want to get into a fight, so you just say, yes, you look wonderful, and they, in fact, look absolutely hideous. We can imagine this scenario, right? Well, the duration of the consequences, well, your lying is going to give you immediate sort of relief. It'll make your partner happy. You don't have to deal with you just like, okay, I don't have to fight with you about it. Don't have to, we can just move merrily along. You go off to your day and you do your thing, but then your partner goes off and has this horribly negative experience. And how long are those consequences going to last? How long is that sort of trauma, social anxiety, social trauma going to last for your partner? Well, you got off easy, but they might not. So you have to think about these things. The intensity of the consequences, right? So how intense is that harm? If it's just the case that a couple of people are just kind of like, oof, that's a weird old outfit that Sally has on today, bless her heart. Okay, that's not that big of a deal. So some people don't like the outfit. But if it's the Real Housewives of Business A, and they just shred this woman's self-esteem with their catfighting bullshit, like some women are prone to do, that could be a very intensely negative, painful experience for your partner, right? She has to go deal with these nasty, catty, god-awful bitches, and that could be a very intense, painful, public humiliation. Hey, but you didn't have to argue with her, so good for you, right? All right, so you might want to think about these things. This is what consequentialism does that I like about consequentialism. It makes you think about the consequences of your actions on other people. And it makes you try to think long-term about this. Instead of just, what's good for me in this situation? Oh, I'm just going to lie. You're not thinking, you can tell yourself that's what's best for your partner, but if you really stopped and you really thought about this, and you were really paying attention, what does my partner have to do today? Where is my partner going that they need to be dressed up? Is this an appropriate outfit? They're asking for my opinion. They're asking for my input. I have a moral obligation here to take care of my partner. And if I feel like my partner's putting themselves in a situation, if I just talk to my partner and I find out, what have you got going on today? Who's going to be there? What's this situation? Why have you chosen this outfit? You might find it's better to just sort of say, hey, look, I think that maybe you should choose a different outfit given the activity that you're doing today, that you might be more comfortable in something else, right? It makes you think about other people. It makes you think about what's going on in their lives. What are the consequences for them of your actions? Men, you're really terrible about that. Men are terrible about this. They just care about what's convenient for them in a moment, and they don't really care about the consequences to their partner. I have seen this so many times in so many different ways. And I'm not just talking about, outfits. I'm talking about men just don't want to deal with situations a lot of times. And so they take the easy way out, and then their partner ends up with this like downstream consequences. And it's just like, well, it's not my problem. It's like, no, actually, according to consequentialism, it is your problem. You're a moral monster. So, okay, so intensity. If they have to deal with like the cat fighting bullshit, that's not good. That's a morally problematic thing. All right, so again, we've got the scope, the duration, the intensity, right? Probability. What is the probability of a certain thing happening? Well, in order to assess the probability that a particular outcome is going to occur, that there's going to be a particular consequence, you have to know something about the situation, right? So you have to actually talk to your partner and find out, what is the situation here? What's going on? I need to be involved in order to make a decision that's the morally correct decision. You can't just be on autopilot and go through life and be a morally upstanding person according to a consequentialist. You just can't. You have to pay attention. I feel like I'm preaching. I'm like, God damn it. Listen to me. But this is, this is one thing that I love about consequentialism is it forces you. It forces you outside of yourself. It forces you to actually consider somebody else, to consider what is going on in their lives. I need information to know that I'm being a moral person, that I am behaving in a morally respectable way toward my partner who I'm supposed to love and care about, who's supposed to be able to trust me with their lives. And if I can't even talk to them to find out what's going on in your life, that you're having to make this clothing decision, it might seem like a simple thing to you, but it might not be to them. But unless you actually talk to your partner and you engage with them in an appropriate way, how the fuck do you know? You don't. You don't. So what's the probability? You don't even stop to think, what's the probability that my partner is going to be made fun of and it's going to damage their self-esteem? Well, if you just think lying to avoid a fight is the morally correct thing to do, and you justify that by looking at this very narrow context where it's just your well-being that matters, well, you're a moral monster. I love this about consequentialism. I really do. I really do. Because people do have a tendency to be very egotistical, very egocentric, very much about how can I maximize my benefit in this situation, and then they give a post hoc justification. That's a justification after the fact for how it might have benefited other people, and they call themselves morally upstanding when they're not. And you can tell that they're not, because if you have to do post hoc justifications after the fact, you haven't considered the consequences of your action because you don't care. You just don't care. That's bullshit. Okay? So, what's the probability? Well, I can't assess probabilities unless I have facts. So, honey, what are you doing today? Where are you going? Tell me about this talk that you're giving. Who's going to be there? Blah, 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 blah. Get the facts. Assess the probability. What are the chances that my partner is going to humiliate themselves publicly with this outfit? I'd say that's a pretty high probability given the facts, the information that I have. So I'm going to do what I can to take care of my partner and dissuade them from putting themselves into harm's way. That is a morally correct action, according to utilitarianism. So it might have some problems. It might be complicated trying to figure out what good is, right? So you might think it's just pleasure, but you might think other things are good, right? So there are a lot of different consequentialist theories that define good in different ways. So everybody thinks pleasure is good, but you might think some other things are good too, like desire satisfaction or meaningfulness in life, right? So there are a lot of other things you can take to be good that you try to maximize for other people, not just yourself. So when you just try to maximize benefit for yourself, that's just prudential rationality. That's not morality. But when you try to maximize benefit for other people, that's morality. And a lot of people get very confused about that. They just don't seem to understand that it's other people who matter. Go figure. All right, so, good. So here are things to like about act utilitarianism. Well, there's an objective, it's objectivity. Okay? There's an objective fact about what is going to maximize benefit in any situation. Now, you might not know all of the relevant information in order to calculate that, okay? Because you're not God. But you have to do your best. You have to do your fucking best, right? You have to do your best to gather up enough information to care enough about your community, about your people, about what's going on in their lives, what's going on in the environment. You have to be clued in to people's lives in order to be able to do your best morally. Newsflash. And there's a fact about what's going to maximize benefit for those people. And either you're going to hit it, you're going to get close to it, hitting it, or you're going to completely miss it. And if you're a moral asshole, you're going to completely miss it, and you're not even going to care. It's surprising, not surprising actually, how many people are actually moral assholes. It's amazing. All right, impartiality. This is another thing I love about consequentialist theories, is that they consider everybody's well-being equally. Now, I realize that that's in an ideal world where we don't have biases. People who have racial or gender biases don't consider the well-being of others equally. They discount the well-being of people who are Black. They discount the well-being of people who are not men, or who are non-binary, or who are trans, right? So if you're doing that, consequentialism, this act utilitarianism is going to have a really good explanation for why you're a moral asshole. Because you're supposed to be impartial. But you're not being impartial. When you think about the consequences of your actions, you're only considering the people that you like or the people that you prefer. And then you're going to justify that somehow. Like, well, their well-being matters more than yours because whatever reason. Yeah, that's just bullshit. So, simplicity. So, act utilitarianism is pretty simple. It's got one rule. That's it. You've got one principle that you apply when you're calculating the consequences and considering what action to perform. So that seems pretty straightforward, and it's flexible. It can be applied to a wide range of situations. And it is inclusive. This is another thing to love about it. It's not species specific. Any being that can experience, that can have positive or negative experiences is worthy of moral consideration. So this includes animals. This is a really popular view among vegans and vegetarians and animal activists. And for understandable reasons. I mean, if you've ever watched any of those videos about factory farming, and you have seen the kind of suffering, the massive scale of suffering in factory farms, that'll make you a utilitarian. Because you're going to say, look, this is just, these beings, they're experiencing tremendous pain. When you add up all of that pain, how can the pleasure of eating a steak outweigh the pain that these animals are suffering? You have to really do some mental jujitsu to try to justify that. Or else you just don't care. Some of us just don't give a shit. We just don't think about it. Yes, I'm in a mood today. All right, so here's some things to dislike about act utilitarianism. Now, disliking act utilitarianism doesn't mean that you dislike consequentialisms, right? So like I said, there are a lot of different consequentialist theories that define good in a lot of different ways, and that have different ways of calculating. They're all going to be very similar, though. But if you don't like act utilitarianism, that doesn't mean that you don't prefer some other consequentialist theory. I happen to prefer consequentialism, but I have a very sophisticated consequentialism that I subscribe to because you have a lot of these problems to solve. So here's one, calculating. What the fuck? How do you figure out what a unit of pleasure is? Or any unit of goodness? What's a unit of meaningfulness in life? If you think that meaningfulness in life matters, that it's something that should be promoted, and I do actually think that, can you calculate that the same way you calculate pleasure? Doesn't look like it, right? Looks like a completely different thing. So you can get real sophisticated about these things. I'm not going to get into too much sophistication though, but how do you calculate? And look, calculating can be really difficult too, because you have to know a lot about a situation and be able to sort of estimate the probabilities of outcomes, right? What's the likelihood that this is going to happen, that I need to take this into consideration? And if you're an anxious person, you're going to way overestimate the negative consequences, the probability of the negative consequences. So it can be really daunting, right? So there are things in our brains that can send us off the rails in terms of calculating, what's the probability of this negative outcome versus this positive outcome, right? So that can be difficult. This theory can be difficult in that way. It also has very heavy demands. So every action that you perform has consequences. And you are morally responsible for those consequences, whether you consider them or not. So this theory is a very demanding theory. It means that every single day you are probably doing a shit ton of things that are morally wrong. So if you ever thought that you were really an awesome, moral, great human being, which most of us do, I mean, every single one of us, they've done research on this, right? So they've done social science research on this, and they have discovered that every single individual that they've tested thinks that they're a lot more moral than they actually are. So they'll have people give a self-assessment about how moral they are, and everybody's always like, oh, I'm so moral. I'm such a moral person. I'm so great. And then they actually put them in a scenario where they test their moral behavior, and they fail. It's like, nope, you're a moral asshole, just like the next guy. So one thing that I do like about consequentialism is you might think that the heavy demands are a downside of the theory. You might think, wow, that's way too demanding. No, actually, I kind of think it's a good reminder. It's a good reminder that none of us is fucking God. None of us is walking on water and healing the sick with a touch, right? Feeding 5,000. We're not Jesus. I mean, assuming Jesus was the perfect moral being that religion makes him out to be. I don't have a view about that, but I'm just saying that's an example that people are familiar with, so I'm going to use it. Mother Teresa, right? Consequentialism, if you're really going to be a true consequentialist, you're going to always be aware of the fact that you're not fucking Mother Teresa. Good. I think that's great. I think that our world would be a better place if people were less certain about their moral, their level of morality, the morality of their behavior, how good they are as people. Okay, so the next thing that people think is kind of a problem with this theory is that it allows for the violation of rights. So, according to ACT utilitarianism, if suppose that you can bring about world peace, and that's going to bring about a shit ton of pleasure for a shit ton of people, world peace, right? But if you can bring about world peace by torturing a child, then ACT utilitarianism says you have a moral obligation to torture that child. Now, this is a far-fetched scenario. A lot of these scenarios that we come up with are far-fetched, and they're far-fetched because they're engineered to sort of focus you on a really interesting and relevant philosophical distinction, right? Is it the case that you're ever going to be in a situation where you can bring about world peace by torturing a child? It is highly unlikely. It is highly unlikely, right? That might be possible in some realm, but it is certainly highly unlikely to happen. Okay, so I understand that these scenarios are, not likely to happen. They're not intended to make you think about an average, everyday situation. They're intended to make you think about the principles, right? So if a principle tells you that the morally correct action is torturing a child, you might think that that there's something wrong with the principle. Okay, so the fact that it allows for the violation of rights seems to be a flaw of the theory, because we don't think that that's actually the morally correct thing to do. So it seems like it gets the wrong answer, right? It's not tracking our moral intuitions. Our moral intuitions, if you're just going to say, is it right to torture a child even for world peace? You might think, no, that's never right. That's never okay morally. But if your moral theory says it is, that it's not just okay, that it's a moral obligation, then you're going to say, okay, we've got to figure out how to fix this theory, or we need a new one, okay? So some people say this is a deal breaker. ACT utilitarianism has to be a false theory because of this very problem. And here's a related problem, the problem of injustices. So if overall utility, or the greatest good for the greatest people, is all that matters, then the majority takes precedence. The pleasure of the majority takes precedence over the pleasure of the minority. So if oppressing black people brings the greatest amount of pleasure to white people who are the majority, then we have a moral obligation to do it. Yeah, that seems like a problem, doesn't it? So it has a problem with violating rights, and it has a problem with injustices. How do you solve these problems? There are ways to solve these problems. You have to get really sophisticated with your view of what good consists in, though. So here's my second discussion question for the class, and that is, how might a utilitarian solve this problem of injustices? And think about it, you can think about it specifically in terms of the example that I've given, oppressing black people. If you're going to be a utilitarian and you're going to enact utilitarian, you're going to subscribe to this foundational moral principle that the morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest overall good for the greatest number of people. How can you say that oppressing black people is wrong if it produces the greatest overall good for the greatest number of people? Think about that. You can solve that problem. There are ways to solve the problem. Now think about it. So that's the second discussion question that you can do. You don't have to do both discussion questions, just do one or the other. But that's the end of the lecture. And I'm done being a cranky, preachy bitch today. So thanks for tuning in. I will give you instructions for how to do the discussion questions this week. I will post those on Blackboard as soon as I get this video uploaded. Okay, thanks for hanging in there with me. Don't be a moral asshole, okay? Whatever you do, don't be a moral asshole.